exprimer comme il faut. Donc, le secrétaire général va vous lire effectivement les deux sujets et les différents intervenants. Le document est fait en anglais, donc je ne saurais pas le lire correctement. Monsieur le secrétaire général, vous avez la parole.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the second part of your program is a panel discussion, and we have part 1 and part 2. Part 1, the topic is overview of initiatives undertaken by the Ecowas Parliament with the support of the IPU. The main topic, Mr. Speaker, if I may read, eradication of child labor, taking stock and sustaining the commitment of the Ecowas Parliament. Eradication of child labor, taking stock and sustaining the commitment of the Ecowas Parliament. And this part 1 of the topic, the subtopic, is overview of initiatives undertaken by the ECOWAS Parliament with the support of the IPU. And the panelists are Honorable Ayaraga Mahama, member of the Committee on Human Rights and Child Protection, Mr. Akiu Afuda, Program Officer, Inter-Parliamentary Union. The part 2, building a strong alliance against child labor. Building a strong alliance against child labor. And the panelists are Ms. Agatha Kulawole, National Project Director, Action Against Child Labor in Agriculture in West Africa, ACLAWA, Abuja Office, Child Labor and Trafficking in Persons Focal Officer. Then, Mr. Samuel Adonteng, All Africa Students Union, ASU, and Mr. Owen James, Director, Global March. The third part of the program, sharing national good practices from the region. Sharing national good practices from the region. And the panelists are Ms. Mariama Baba Musa, former Member of Parliament, Republic of Benin. Ms. Aminu Abubakar, Child Labor Survivor, Nigeria. Mr. Speaker, these are the subtopics and then the panelists to do the presentations. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Donc, le premier intervenant a la parole. Merci.
The Right Honorable Speaker, representatives of the IPU present here, colleagues, members of Parliament, representing various delegations. It is a pleasure to share this platform with these eminent persons to discuss a matter that is so dear and important to all of us, which is the fate of our children in West Africa. Child labor or forced labor needs no definition. We all know what child labor is, even though in West Africa, in various countries, we tend to disagree on what aspects of child labor should be acceptable and what aspects of child labor should be unacceptable. In our various national parliaments, and in our various public discussions, we have tended to want to accept certain forms of child labor as part of training programs and child development programs. And we also know that certain forms of child labor are clearly unacceptable. I know that in my own country, Ghana, we have a problem of children being used in dangerous mining activities. That clearly is an issue. We also know about children being used in dangerous fishing practices. Those are clearly unacceptable. And we have situations where children are being moved from rural areas to urban areas to serve as house helps, providing labor in very unacceptable conditions. We know about children being used as farm labor. We know children being sent as apprentices to learn all forms of trade at very young ages. And during those years of their training, they also double as labor for their masters and mistresses. Clearly, those are unacceptable forms of child labor. So indeed, it's a fact that we have a problem of child labor with us in the continent. What does Ecowas Parliament do about child labor? Ecowas Parliament is part of a network of regional governance institutions guided by policy positions that those institutions accept. When we have a comprehensive framework of promotion and respect for human rights that all countries that are part of ECOWAS subscribe to, I believe every single one of the 15 members of the community do subscribe to all the existing human rights regimes and how they proscribe child labor. We also have ratified all the international agreements relating to the International Labour Organization, and especially the parts that prohibit child labor and forced labor. The issue is implementation. What mechanisms exist for implementing these standards that we have all signed up to? For the Ecowas Parliament, as part of the Regional Action Plan to deal with the problem of child labor, we intend to be involved in giving policy approvals to the Council of Ministers to legislate and regulate standards and also set commitments for Ecowas countries in the matter of child labor. But also within the workings of the Ecowas Parliament, we have the Human Rights Committee. The Human Rights Committee takes responsibility for monitoring the human rights situation in the country, in the sub-region. And on several occasions, the Human Rights Committee has had the opportunity to engage with countries, to go on missions, and to see the situation in relation to human rights generally in some of the countries in the sub-region, and in particular, human rights issues that border on the welfare of children, and invariably in the matter of child labor and forced labor. Another mechanism that we use in the Parliament to deal with the issue of child labor is our country reporting program. As colleagues will know, we report annually and regularly on our various countries. And if you review the standards and criteria for reporting or writing the country reports, you will know that human rights and the welfare of children and issues of child labor are a prerequisite in terms of what should be contained in the annual reports that we receive. These reports give us a snapshot of what the situation is in the various countries in relation to the welfare of children and child labor and forced labor, and what other countries are doing in relation to efforts to curb the menace of child labor and forced labor. These reports give colleagues an idea of practices and institutional arrangements in the various countries, and the reports and the discussions of the reports tend to be an eye-opener and expose colleagues to ideas about institutional arrangements and legislation that could be copied and used in countries that do not have those mechanisms. The Parliament also undertakes country visits, what we call missions. And when those missions go out there, they tend to visit the various institutions of the member countries and see the extent to which they are functioning to be able to deal with the problem of child labor. And as the Right Honourable Speaker presiding mentioned earlier, even recently, we've had to give approvals in relation to some matters relating to child labor and forced labor. So, in a snapshot, this is the framework, and this is how it is expected to function. But more fundamentally, the issue of child labor and forced labor are just an indication of the issues of poverty and the capacity of parents to take care of their own children, and for countries to be able to finance the welfare of their populations and also institutions that are responsible for education, for social welfare, and for enforcement where communities fail to meet expected standards. At the level of a sub-regional parliament, some of the debates that have taken place on the floor of our parliament relate to global issues that have an impact on the capacity of our various countries to address the issues of child labor. The Sustainable Development Goals set out the issues of decent work, and the need which is one of the issue of child labor is one of the issues. That has an earlier accomplishment time frame, which is 2025. And then we have all the other 16 goals having a much longer implementation time frame. I dare say that the success of implementing Goal 8 actually depends on being able to implement the earlier goals. If you don't deal with the issue of hunger, parents will send their children out there to labor to be able to feed the family. If you don't deal with the other issues of unemployment income inequality, and etc. You undermine the capacity of parents to be able to take care of their children. And so they will give those children out, and those children will be the subject of child labor and forced labor. So I have thought that the achievement of the early goals set the conditions for us to be able to achieve goal 8. And lastly, and more fundamentally, as a Sovereign General Parliament, let me indicate that the Ecowas itself is a framework for dealing with the fundamental issues that engender child labor and forced labor. Why do I say so? If we open our borders, we train around ourselves, we reduce the barriers, we definitely internally will be able to generate wealth. And when we generate wealth, that wealth, if it is shared equitably, will enable households to be able to take care of their children and reduce the incidence of child labor. We are part of a continental effort to promote free trade, and we believe that equally will achieve that effect. But Africa, and of course West Africa, which is part of Africa, has been a victim over the decades of illicit wealth transfers across into Europe, North America, and recently into Asia. The reports indicate that annually over 800 billion United States dollars is illicitly transferred from Africa to Europe, to North America, and to Asia. And if you assess the budget financing gaps of African countries, you will find out that annually we have about $50 billion budget financing gaps across the continent, and yet we are illicitly transferring over 800 billion when we need about 500 billion to fill in our gaps. And so if the advocacy that the IPU and other global organizations widely networked can focus on Europe, North America, and Asia, assisting to plug those holes that enable activities like illicit wealth transfer from Africa to the developed world, and that wealth remains in Africa, it will enhance the capacity of governments and countries in Africa to be able to improve the livelihoods of our people and strengthen institutional mechanisms to deal with so many issues, including the issues of the welfare of children and forced labor and child labor. And then also, if North America, Europe, and Asia will remove the barriers to trading with Africa and allow Africa to trade effectively with them, I believe that the wealth that will be generated for Africa will enable us to be able to deal with these issues of child labor and forced labor. Because at the very bottom of it, really, is a question of resources. Nobody ever gives birth to a child wanting the child to engage in forced labor or child labor as a means of survival. But sometimes parents are driven to it. No country wants to watch its children being subjected to those conditions, but they just don't have the budgetary capacity to deal with the problems and to support the institutions that are supposed to deal with the problem. And this one is really my last point is that there has to be equity in the distribution of wealth, both internally and globally. If you look at our various African countries, sometimes you find a very small percentage of the population keeping a large chunk of the country's wealth, and we haven't quite mastered the capacity to reconfigure our tax regimes to be able to effectively transfer wealth from the extremely rich to the very vulnerable and poor. The same applies to the global level, where you have 1% of the population sometimes keeping half of the entire world's wealth, just 1% keeping half, 10% keeping about 90% or 80 to 90% of the wealth of the world. These create setups where we are unable to deal with the problems of child labor and forced labor. So, colleagues, Right Honorable Speaker, I believe that the Ecowas Parliament is very well positioned to take on the issues of child labor, and we have been doing some work in that regard. What is needed is a better focus. I recall that we now have EcoFEPA. EcoFEPA can be a very effective and efficient platform for making sure that in our various country reports, they pay attention to the reporting on the issues of child labor and forced labor. And I believe going forward, what we have learned here today, the advocacy that has been done here by the Nobel Prize laureates and the IPU will inspire us to begin to pay greater attention to the issues of child labor. Thank you very much, colleagues.
Merci, mon cher ami Ayerga. Le suivant.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Good afternoon. I will briefly present, in fact, the context of this meeting and also to recall briefly achievement that we reached so far that Honorable Ayariga just presented. The assistance provided to the Ecowas Parliament is part of the IPU overall strategy, which aim at sensitizing Parliament to the right of the child and strengthen the capacity to promote and protect these rights. Addressing specific child rights protection issues requiring parliamentary action, including child trafficking and child labor, which is our current meeting today. And the third one is to increasing parliamentary involvement in the work of the UN Committee on the Right of the Child. So to reach this objective, the IPU established a strong partnership with UNICEF, the Committee on the Right of the Child, and recently with Kailash Satyarthi Foundation for Children. In this perspective, the IPU joined Fair Share campaign to mark the UN 2021 year on the elimination of child labor. Members of the Parliament of ECOWAS Parliament, with the crucial support of the IPU and the International Labour Organization represented here by Madame Kolawole, have been engaged in combating child trafficking in labor and promote the best interest of the child as enshrined in the Convention on the Rights of the Child a while ago. In May 2016, they agreed on a number of measures to be implemented, including one, considering where national and inter-regional work might be mutually reinforcing, and second, sharing good practices and identifying priorities and plan for the implementation in the short, medium, and long term. In November 2018, they assessed the implementation of measures that they agree on during the last meeting in May 2016. The following were recorded. One national level follow-up seminar took place and conclude with short, medium, and long-term parliamentary strategies. In some cases, these strategies led to the adoption of and approval of national action plan to prevent child trafficking and labor. We have the case of Burkina Faso. Parliamentarians have taken part in consultation meetings about the process of revising the list of all forms of hazardous work. This was organized nationally in various regions, in Mali, for instance. We also have a project run jointly with Care International, which has been delivered to promote girls' education, through which children who were out of school were gathered together in informal education programs. A protection and advocacy program for domestic work has been set up in Togo, for instance. Now, as a perspective, the IPU collaboration with Kailash Satyarthi Foundation for Children brought new momentum to the parliamentary mobilization against that scourge, as it broadens the scope of the solutions through the initiative on justice for African children. We've just heard Mr. Satyarthi eloquent speech right now. This initiative should be interesting in the view that the Ecowas Committee on Gender, Women, Empowerment, and Social Protection that deal with combating child trafficking and labor should consider the recommendation of this initiative, I mean, justice for African children, in light of its approach to form a common front with the Ecowas Parliament to prevent child trafficking and labor. That perspective should enable experiences to be shared, information to be exchanged more easily, and the complementary quality of all concerned to be enhanced. So, Mr. Chair, this is briefly present. I know that we have many other speakers, so I will stop here, and thank you for your attention.
Merci. Donc la parole est à la partie de Building a Strong Alliance, Mrs. Agatha Kolayola.
Thank you so much, Honorable Speaker, members of the panel here, seated up here, and the honorables. I will be brief because of time, but I will definitely present that which I have been assigned to present today. A lot have been said concerning the global report on the elimination of child labor. There's a slide to be presented. I don't know if you're going to show the slide. Akio? Are we showing the slides? Okay. All right, in 2016, the world, as we experienced at least for about 5 or 6 years, recorded a reduction in the global prevalence of child labor. However, this does not reflect the situation in sub-Saharan Africa, because as at then, there was an increase in sub-Saharan Africa, and that definitely indicated the need for more support to be targeted at eliminating child labor in sub-Saharan Africa. However, there was a change in the story in 2020. The report that the ILO and the report that was released in 2021 by ILO and UNICEF indicated a global increase of about 8 million plus children in child labor. And we had about 16.6 million children in child labor, additional children in child labor in Africa between 2016 and 2020. So you agree with me that eliminating child labor should be on our minds, should be what our countries should focus on, because it is indeed a case that requires a lot of support across the globe. But more lies with us, because you know we also have the population in West Africa. So in 2018, 2019, the Ecowas Commission, in collaboration with the International Labour Organization, conducted an evaluation of the implementation of child labor, especially the regional action plan, to measure how far we have gone and be able to identify the various challenges in the elimination of child labor. And so I will be presenting some of the facts, some of the results of these reports, and then be able to discuss ways that we feel we should actually focus on to strengthen the elimination of child labor within the region. And then I'll also talk a little about, sorry, we should be on the fourth slide, talk a little about the Alliance, Global Alliance 8.7, which is an alliance focused on eliminating child labor and achieving the SDG 8.7. And lastly, give a brief description on what we think the parliamentarians could do to accelerate action in the elimination of child labor and achievement of SDG 8.7. The ECOWAS evaluation of the regional action plan identified, like was said earlier on, that the 15 countries in the region have ratified the two main conventions in the elimination of child labor, Convention 182 and Convention 138. Actually, for Convention 182, we have recorded a universal ratification. So it's across the globe, all members of the ILO have ratified this convention. But for Convention 138, we still have 2 countries that are yet to ratify. But within the region, in West Africa, all of our member states have ratified the Convention 138, which is the Convention on the Minimum Age for Employment, and Convention 182, which is the Convention on the Elimination of the Worst Forms of Child Labor. And they also have agreed on various minimum age. We have Benin, Niger, having the minimum age at 14, and then we have other countries 15 and others 16. However, for some countries, these have not been included. We are waiting for it to be included in their labor laws. There are countries that have amended their minimum age for employment. I give an example of Nigeria. Nigeria has agreed that the minimum age for employment will be 15 by the National Steering Committee on Child Labor. So the proposal was presented to the Federal Executive Council, and FEC has approved that the minimum age for employment in Nigeria will be 15. However, we await the passing of the Labor Standard Bill to effect this change. So right now, we are working on 16. Member states have also developed the hazardous child labor list. And so they have various lists of jobs or work that children should not be engaged in. And so looking through the various lists, we actually identify that member states have agreed that farming, including fishing, and especially fishing and its processes, are actually not safe for children, so they are not supposed to be engaged in that. Chemical fertilizers and pesticide usage, not good for children, are not supposed to be engaged in that. So there are other commercial sexual exploitation, use of children in pornography, sometimes also for trafficking in the persons, child trafficking, forced labor in domestic work, forced begging through exploitation in the disguise that they're actually going to learn some Quranic lessons, forced ritual substitute for girls, as we have it in a part in Ghana, the Tirokosi tradition. We also have forced recruitment of children by non-state armed groups and extremist military groups that actually causes conflict around our environment. Looking at the National Action Plan, 80% of our member states have adopted their National Action Plan. So they have a National Action Plan being implemented. Some plans are actually mainstreamed into the child protection plans, but they have a National Action Plan that responds to the elimination of child labor. However, 73% of this National Action Plan was not just developed by a department in a ministry, but actually involves multiple stakeholders. And this is actually a plus and should be recommended. We also have 80% of them setting priorities for action. This is very, very important and should also be recommended. We have the National Coordination Committee with different names in different countries. And this actually system is in place in about 60% of our countries. So it is not every country that has a national coordinating committee that coordinates the affairs of the elimination of child labor and follow up with the implementation of the National Action Plan that were developed. We have 40% of them responding to the fact that their National Action Plan has improved or has contributed to the improvement of the child labor elimination situations in their various countries. And we also have 6% of our member states that reported that they have a coordinating child labor unit, meaning that the implementation, the National Steering Committee is being coordinated by a child labor unit. So we only have the 6% actually across our member states. And I've discussed earlier on about the ratifications. So we have ratified Convention 182. I said that's the complete ratification across the member state, 182 and 138. Member states also have their hazardous list. Member states also have adopted NAP. I've discussed that earlier on. Member states have set priorities for action of their NAP. Member states have national coordinating committees. Member states have multiple stakeholders, but we actually have them in different percentage. But this really is a plus across the region. It wasn't so some time ago, but we are making progress within the West Africa region. But we have like Convention 189, which is the Convention on Domestic Workers. The convention that is ensuring decent work for all domestic workers. That convention has only been ratified by 7% of 13%, sorry, of our member states. And I can tell you, we have actually been ratified by Guinea-Conakry and Sierra Leone. The remaining 13 actually have not ratified Convention 189. And that is one convention that we know is also very, very important in the elimination of child labor, because we have child domestic workers and we have children within the legal working age that are also domestic workers. Further findings discover that the occurrences and indices of child labor in West Africa have really not changed significantly since 2012. We have it really around what it used to be, and that child labor is highly prevalent in semi-formal and informal sector. This we know, with very few cases in the formal sector. However, that also does not exclude the formal sector, because the formal sector is supposed to at least provide that guidance, because they all have that supply chain. So you also need to provide that guidance to at least on part of the informal sector. And it also revealed that the agricultural sector accounts for 85% of child labor. That's about 61.4 million children in Africa. Children in the youngest age bracket also constitute that children between the ages of 5, 11, also constitute largest group in child labor and also in hazardous work, which is scary, very, very scary, and it endangers their health, safety, and moral development. Most of the children in child labor are unpaid workers. Most of them are unpaid workers. We also have rising incidences and impact of terrorism, climate change, migration, emergencies, and humanitarian crises within our region. And this is rapidly changing the child labor context, because we are now having increased number of children being vulnerable to trafficking or to being exploited in the workplace. Especially we have children in the IDP camps that are actually not being cared for as expected, and a good number of them are being exploited. We also have the emergence of COVID-19, which also causes a lot, which actually caused a lot of challenges. We have parents losing their jobs, and so their children actually definitely became vulnerable to this exploitation. So a lot actually we had a lot of challenges during the COVID-19 pandemic. We got testimonies of countries that were able to at least provide some palliatives, but notwithstanding, we know that it's possible that that also had contributed to the increased number of prevalence of child labor across the globe. Now, looking at strengthening systems in the elimination of child labor, we would recommend the following based on the evaluation that was conducted. One is to reinforce legislation. We look forward to closing gaps in laws and policies. I talked earlier on about probably reviewing the Labor Act, if we have the laws in our various countries, to ensure that they are of international standards and they are enough as it is to protect children from any and every form of exploitation. We also recommend that there is the need to harmonize national laws and policies. We have some laws that are not, I give an example of a law that approves a child of 12 to work in a domestic environment. That law definitely is not in line with international standards. And so there's a need, there's another law in the country that prohibits such work, But so there's really a need for harmonization of laws to ensure that no law is against the other or causing challenges in ensuring justice for our children. We also recommend the need to integrate child labor into national development strategies and in sectoral policies and laws. If we're going to eliminate child labor, it should come at the national level. So when our governments are developing the national strategies, national plans of action, elimination of child labor should be one of the strategies that should be focused on. We also talk about the implementation and enforcement of laws, including the minimum age for employment. If a country is agreeing or in the law stated that a child of 15 should work, then the country should be able to ensure protection for these sets of children in the workplace, and also ensure that they also get jobs that are commensurate with their age and their level, that also can help them survive. So if you're saying a child of 16 should work and a child of 16 cannot be engaged as a civil servant, then there's a problem at that point, because you're also not creating that enabling environment for that child to be gainfully employed. So that child would definitely be exploited by the informal sector. We also look at enforcement of the hazardous lists. In some of the countries where we have the list of hazardous work that children shouldn't be engaged in, these lists are not enforceable because there is no legal backing. We do not have it represented or linked with any of our laws. So how do we back up a list? So we just have the list and it's hanging. How do we enforce this law, the laws backing the list? So we really request that there is a law that actually should enforce the implementation of the list. I give an example. The Labor Standard Bill for Nigeria has taken into cognizance, and there's a provision for the implementation and enforcement of that hazardous list. So we hope that when the Labor Standard Bill is passed into law, then the hazardous child labor list can be enforceable. We also hope that all member states adopt or update their national action plan for the elimination of child labor. Some of these plans are outdated. They've been on for several years, no implementation, but they should be live. We should actually have it been given, they should be live. Our national action plan should not just be a document that is outdated. So we request actually that we actually review the national action plan and then develop a new one if needed. And there's also a need to link up the national action plan with the regional action plans. So it also helps the Ecowas Commission to ensure monitoring, effective monitoring. So right now there is a regional action plan, and so the national action plan, because the regional action plan was developed by national focal points. So they also have taken into cognizance the situation of child labor at the national level. So whatever they have agreed on at the regional level should also reflect the situation at the national level. So there is that link, and it also helps coordination. So we also have it that the National Child Labor Focal Point should be empowered to function effectively. There's a need. You have a focal point, you have the national steering committees, you have the national coordinating committees, but they are just there. There is really no funding, there's really no support. They may not be able to effectively implement their mandates. And we request that at the global, at the national, at the regional level, that we have a national focal point network, like we have it in the trafficking in persons department of the Ecowas Commission, that we actually have the national focal point, the coordinating unit that actually brings the national focal point from the various Ecowas countries together to share knowledge. So actually promotes knowledge sharing. They also discuss issues around implementation of the various legal frameworks. So this we also want to recommend that we have the establishment of the national focal points on elimination of child labor. We also recommend issues around member states to address capacity building needs, also of the national focal points, if there's really no capacity, and this actually points to the Ministry of Labor and Employment. We also have issues around resource mobilization, which you agree with me that cuts across so many other areas of intervention, so we can never stop talking about resource mobilization, and this actually is very, very, very important. Member states are also expected to focus on strengthening the systems at both the national level, which also includes strengthening the child protection system. So like the Honorable said earlier on, it's difficult for you to eliminate child labor just focusing on child labor alone. There's a need for us to have this wholesome approach in the elimination of child labor. In brief, I talk about Alliance 8.7. Alliance 8.7 is a response, a direct response to the elimination of child labor in achieving the SDG 8.7. And we all know that SDG Goal 8 Target 7 focus on member states, or recommend that member states should take immediate and effective measures to eradicate forced labor, end modern-day slavery and human trafficking, and secure the prohibition and elimination of the worst forms of child labor, including recruitment and use of child soldiers by 2030, and 2025 end child labor in all its forms. So the focus on the 2025 was more on the ending of the worst forms of child labor, not really on the other aspect of forced labor and human trafficking. So now, this is 2023. Do you really think we can end child labor by 2025? That's left to you, Mars and SARS, for response. So as I said, Alliance 8.7 is a global network, and this network is supposed to also have its replication at the country level. And at the country level, we call them the Pathfinder countries. But at the global level, Alliance engages both the government, employers, workers, individual NGOs. We also have academias. It's a network that is open to all that have the capacity to support the elimination of child labor. And Alliance have four main objectives. We have the accelerating and coordinating action. We have the conducting research and sharing knowledge. We also focus on issues around driving innovation, looking at innovative response to the elimination of child labor, especially its root causes. We also have the need to actually increase and leverage resources. And this we have, well, I can say we are making progress, because we see various donors coming together to support, to contribute to the elimination of child labor at different levels. At the global level, Alliance is being chaired by different countries. So we have the chair, the deputy chair. We also have the representative from all stakeholder groups, and we also have what we call the observers. We also have, Alliance have four main technical working group. We have the supply chain, we have the migration group, we have the humanitarian setting and conflict thematic group, and we also have the rule of law and governance thematic group. The supply chain actually is being led by ILO, IOM for migration, UNICEF for humanitarian setting and conflict, and we have OHCHR for the rule of law and governance. ILO provide the secretariat for Alliance 8.7 at the global level. As a Pathfinder country, for you to be a Pathfinder country, the country needs to indicate interest. So we have some countries in West Africa that are members of Alliance 8.7. We have Nigeria, we have Abidjan, Cote d'Ivoire, we have Ghana coming up. Ghana is actually working on their their national consultation workshop. So we actually have some countries that have indicated interest, and they're already members of Alliance 8.7. We have each country are expected to organize national consultation after indicating interest, and they also define their national strategy and roadmaps. They also need to collect relevant data and then mobilize resources focused on eliminating child labor. That means this country needs to have like a budget line that is targeted at eliminating child labor. As I round up, I want to speak on what we expect our parliamentarians to actually focus on for us. One, promote the ratification of Convention 189. Convention 189, actually the Convention on Domestic Work, and also the Protocol 29, which actually promotes the development of a national policy in consultation with social partners. The protocol deals with prevention, protection, and access to justice particularly. So we actually look at you helping in that. In the area of prevention, we are requesting that there should be establishment of legislation to provide education, training, and other awareness-raising mechanism to also ensure legislation that all workers are covered and no group of workers, including working children and migrants, are excluded or discriminated against. Under protection, we request that we focus on ensuring access to justice by strengthening the legal frameworks that give victims access to justice with criteria of impartiality, access without discrimination, confidentiality principles, and so on. We look forward also to issues around reviewing existing, talk about the child labor legislation, and also close gaps, as I've said earlier on. We also advocate that there should be sufficient fundings for national action plan. Finally, we look forward to parliamentarians advocating for the participation of our various countries in the Alliance 8.7 global network, so that our countries can also be Pathfinder countries. Pathfinder countries also have their benefits. There's a platform for knowledge sharing. There's a platform also for technical support that comes to countries that are Pathfinder countries. And finally, I want to reiterate by stating that we need funds to ensure the implementation of our national action plan for the elimination of child labor. No funds, we may not be able to record the success that we look forward to achieving in the elimination of child labor. Thank you so much. Merci, obrigado.
Merci, madame. Vous avez promis ne pas être longue, mais vous avez pris le maximum de temps qu'il vous faut. Je voudrais vous suggérer quelque chose parce qu'il est bientôt 14 heures et je crois qu'il est l'heure de prier. Donc, avant de continuer au prochain intervenant, est-ce qu'il ne serait pas mieux de prendre 15 minutes pour permettre aux uns et aux autres d'aller prier et voire même faire le lunch et puis reprendre les travaux? Parce que c'est trop compliqué. Il est bientôt 14 heures. Manger en même temps, en 15 minutes, permettre aux uns et aux autres de prier et puis... Merci. La séance est suspendue. À 14h30, s'il vous plaît. Merci.
Président, Président, s'il vous plaît. Si le déjeuner est inclus, en 30 minutes, c'est pas évident. Bon, d'accord.
On va essayer. Merci.
Speaker.
Honorables députés, chers collègues, la séance est reprise. Donc le prochain intervenant est M. Samuel Odotang. Vous avez la parole, monsieur.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Distinguished guests, colleagues, and friends, I am honored to speak to you today about the eradication of child labor, an issue that continues to affect millions of children around the world, particularly in developing countries, including those in West Africa. As the Provost Officer for Education and Students' Rights at the All Africa Student Union, the continent's largest student-led organization, we are deeply committed to this cause, and I am proud of the work that our organizations have done in collaborating with other partners to end the menace of child labor. Over the past few years, I have had the privilege of personally co-leading campaigns to ensure that young people have access to quality education and are protected from the injustices of child labor. These have included collaborative programs such as the Africa Education Enrollment Program, the Africa Girls Back to School campaign that we organized in partnership with UNESCO and the 100 Million campaign. And also the global youth-led movements such as the Justice for Africa campaign and the Justice for Every Child campaign that have also been done with the Kailash Satyarthi Foundation and the 100 Million campaign. I am partially drawn to these engagements because I am a living testament of the power of education and how it can turn around the fortunes for many children, especially for those living in poor communities. The All African Student Union has been working with partners such as the 100 Million campaign, the Global March, the Kailash Satyarthi Foundation, and the Global Students Forum to demand an end to child labor everywhere. We believe that delivering every child's right to free, quality education is the key to ending this injustice. Education not only provides children with the skills and knowledge they need to succeed in life, but schools and teachers create a protective environment that helps to prevent child labor. Despite knowing the invaluable importance of education, one of the challenges that we face in West Africa is the lack of access to quality education for so many children. According to UNESCO, 29 million children of primary school going age are still out of school in the region, with girls being disproportionately affected. The COVID-19 pandemic, as we know it, further exacerbated this issue, with school closures affecting millions of children across the region, leading thousands of children being unable to return to school even when schools have been reopened. In addition, poverty and lack of social protection measures are fueling this education crisis, with many families forced to send their children to work to supplement their income, particularly in rural areas where access to education and other social services is limited. In West Africa, poverty rates remain high, with over 50% of the population living below the poverty line in some countries. To address these challenges, students and young people of this continent, with our peers across the world, have been tirelessly advocating for African governments to increase budgetary allocations to social interventions such as education and social protection, as well as child labor prevention policies. We have also been campaigning for universal child benefits for every child and having this transformative measure prioritized in national budgets. I think earlier Mr. Kailas Satiati spoke about this. We strongly believe that by investing in these key areas, governments can create a protective and proactive environment that helps prevent child labor. We also advocate for stronger laws and policies that prohibit child labor and protect the rights of children. We must also ensure that these funds, legal interventions, and programs are accessible to all children, regardless of their socio-economic status, gender, or ethnicity. However, it is not enough for just our domestic budgets in Africa to prioritize our children. The international community must also meet its aid responsibilities through child-focused funding. This means that providing adequate funding to programs that focus on ending child labor, promoting education, and providing social protection. We need a comprehensive approach that addresses the root causes of child labor, such as poverty, lack of education, and social inequality. We must also work to achieve the just representation of African countries in global decision-making spaces. This includes reforming the International Monetary Fund to give greater voice to African countries and end the discrimination in special drawing rights. We must also establish fair tax and trade rules among African countries and end with the international community as equal partners. It is crucial to recognize that centuries of subjugation have left many African countries in a position of financial vulnerability, making them susceptible to debt and economic exploitation. Making up for this historical injustice requires bold and courageous steps. Ultimately, there won't be a way around cancelling all debts for low and lower middle income countries in Africa. Simultaneously, we have to ensure that corrupt leadership and businesses are held accountable. Our current campaign, Demanding Justice for Africa, addresses these critical issues and calls out the devastating injustices that Africa faces at the hands of the international community. From mobilizations in our countries, meetings with our representatives, and over 70 youth and students-led organizations from 30 countries around the world, we have been writing to the International Monetary Fund, and we have already attracted responses from the Swiss and German governments and also from the Office of the UN Secretary General. We remain committed to creating a better Africa for all. There have been some positive developments in recent years, particularly with regards to policy and legal frameworks. For example, we hear of the framework that Ecowas has already been working on, especially in the sense of trying to eliminate child labor in all of its forms. It is crucial to recognize that in all of its forms. Currently, we face an uphill battle, especially in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic, which has had a significant impact on the lives of children in West Africa, with school closures, economic disruptions, and increased poverty rates, which are increasing the risk of child labor. This is why we need a multifaceted alliance to end child labor, and why the voices of students and young people are so important in this effort. Students and young people are among the most affected by the issue of child labor, and they have a unique perspectives on the challenges that are needed to be addressed. They can also play an active role in advocating for change, both at the national and international levels. The youth of this continent believe that education is a fundamental right that should be accessible to all children, regardless of their background. We also believe that education is a powerful tool for social change and that it can help create a more just and equitable society. By investing in education, we can help to create a future where child labor is a thing of the past and where all children have the opportunity to reach their full potential. In conclusion, I would like to reiterate our commitment to ending child labor in West Africa and around the world. We urge you as political leaders to work with us, amplify our existing efforts to end child labor, and recognize the expertise, networks, and energy we bring to the table. Only by working together can we create a world where children's rights to freedom, safety, and education are protected, where every child can pursue their dreams and reach their full potential. Thank you.
Merci, Monsieur Samuel. Donc, la parole est au prochain intervenant.
Thank you, Right Honourable Speaker. And it's a great personal honour for me to speak with you all today in this special venue and in front of such leaders from so many countries. I have to acknowledge that I wish it was my African colleague Winnie Nandiga who was speaking instead, but today she has a master's exam, so I'm afraid you get me. For the next 10 minutes, with the help of a few graphs, I'm going to follow up the discussion from this morning and share some of the findings from the Justice for Africa's Children report that was commissioned by the group of African laureates, leaders, and youth organizations. I'm going to focus on the international injustices in the report for two reasons. One, the international side has the biggest financial impact. And secondly, I believe people outside of Africa, especially from my part of the world, should look on the international side and listen on the national issues. My colleagues on the panel are better placed. The ILO and UNICEF announced a shock global increase in child labor in the first 4 years of the SDGs. More children were being excluded and exploited, not yet less. Yet there was a difference between regions. If you go to the next slide, you'll see that the simple graph shows what happens. The first line shows total child labor in the rest of the world since 2012, and it's a drop of some 35 million. The second line shows the huge increase in sub-Saharan Africa, so big that it is now outweighing the fall elsewhere. In fact, since the SDGs started, over 10,000 African children have become child laborers every single day, the majority of them young children under 11. Now, Speaker, with permission, I might speak from there so I can see the slides. Is that okay? If I switch to a different microphone? No. Thank you.
Oui, il n'y a pas de problème.
Thank you, thank you. And if we could go back a couple of slides, sorry. We could go back. Back again. Perfect. OK.
Les tableaux ici ne sont pas en marche, hein, donc ce n'est pas projeté sur les tableaux qui sont. Il n'y a pas de problème. Il peut rester là-bas. Hein. Allez-y, ça ne nous dérange pas. Allez-y. Go on.
Thank you.
Continue.
So if we could get the graph back up.
IT.
I need the... Okay, thank you. If we could go back one slide, sorry. Thank you, thank you. Okay. So a round table of African leaders from the Nobel Laureates and Leaders for Children group and African youth leaders in the 100 Million campaign, together with Mr. Chungong and Mr. Satyati, decided to investigate it. And the first question was, why has this happened with child labor and not with other sectors and other SDGs? But when you look closely, it's clear that it is what is happening elsewhere too. Next slide, please. For example, if we review the change in the number of children out of school since 2015, we can see at every level, primary, lower secondary, secondary school, the same pattern of a major reduction in out-of-school children in the rest of the world and a shocking rise in children out of school in sub-Saharan Africa. Far from being a one-off, the data is similar on child stunting from malnutrition. And as the next graph shows, next slide please, it is similar for extreme poverty. This shows the change in the number of people living on less than $2.15 a day in sub-Saharan Africa since 2005. The first few years see a mixed progress. Some years a slight fall, others a slight rise. But look what happens when we get to 2015. A huge increase during the SDGs, a rise of over 20 million people as reported by the IMF, even before the pandemic, and over half of them are children. And the scale of change is even clearer when we consider where in the world the very poorest live. In 2015, more lived outside of sub-Saharan Africa, but by 2019, just 4 years later, over 60% lived in sub-Saharan Africa. That's a titanic and historic shift in inequality between the world's regions. So, why has this happened? Well, if we look at the GDP per person on the next slide, GDP per person is probably the most common measure of comparing wealth between countries. Next, please. Thank you. You can see significant percentage growth in richer regions. A dip for the pandemic in 2020, but it soon bounces back. But for sub-Saharan Africa, it's a very different story. Although the world grew by $11 trillion between 2015 and 2021, GDP per person in sub-Saharan Africa actually fell. And if we compare the changes by US dollars, not percentages, you can see something else. It would only take a tiny share of rich country wealth for sub-Saharan Africa to be able to grow at the same rate as other countries in the world. Richer countries would barely notice. But this hasn't been happening. And if we go to the next slide, we can see that since 1980, wealth per person has increased by tens of thousands of dollars in richer countries, 20,000 in high-income countries, 29,000 in North America. But in Africa, it has increased since 1980 by only $96. It has gone up more every 10 weeks in rich countries than it has in 41 years in sub-Saharan Africa. Historic, if you could go back a slide, please. Historic injustices that have never been rectified left this world incredibly unequal in 1980. But something else in our world has been increasing this inequality still further for African children. So what could it be? Why is Africa getting such a low share of global growth? Does it have resources? Yes, huge natural resources, some of the highest in the world. Are those resources valuable? Are they being used? Yes, many of them are rare and precious and in demand. Those resources are being used in the global economy right now. For example, on the next slide, we look at the DRC. It's in the top 10 countries in the world with the most natural resources. It produces over 70% of the world's cobalt that is used in batteries in mobile phones, laptops, and now cars. It has literally powered the tech boom that has added trillions to global growth in the last decade. But the profits are all moved offshore. The billionaires are created in other countries, and such a little tax is paid to the government in the DRC that they don't have the resources to provide basic services to all their children. Many children in the DRC are left so poor they end up working in the very same cobalt mines to survive. So the first issue to look at, and the report looks at, is tax. And the next slide shows that a new analysis worked out how much tax revenue each country receives per child. And the results are incredibly unequal and bear no relation to a country's natural resources. This shows the average difference in tax revenue per child in Africa and Europe. The tax revenue per child in sub-Saharan Africa in orange is incredibly low, but this is actually an average value. Some 32 countries are even lower. And this is the biggest reason why so many children in Africa have no doctor to see and no school to go to and end up in child labor. The bars for Africa are too small to see trends, but if we look at the percentage change on the next slide, we can see that even this terrible situation is getting rapidly worse. Tax revenue per child in Africa has been declining sharply since the start of the Sustainable Development Goals, in stark contrast to the increasing tax revenue in Europe. This means, in reality, a big fall in health and education budgets. Now, following OECD-led negotiations on a US proposal, the world introduced a fairer global tax deal in 2021. It was a moment of great hope, but unfortunately, it was decided to simply exclude the extractive industries from the global tax deal. The OECD, who led the negotiations, has no African members, yet they're put in charge of the world's tax affairs. Where is the justice? And on the next slide, we can see this graph shows the percentage of funding committed to child supporting budgets, education, health, and social protection in Africa. The dotted lines show the 2015 Incheon commitment to spend 20% of the budget on education, and the 2001 Abuja Declaration to spend 15% of government budgets on health. You can see that there is more that national governments can and must do. But the biggest difference by far is to be found on the previous graph on tax revenue per child. And on the next slide, we can see the inequality in the world's COVID-19 response. It's just as bad. This is the $12 trillion G7 Global Agenda for Action package to support the world through the pandemic, announced 2 years ago. This is the share that went to 48 countries in sub-Saharan Africa, 0.2%. And on top of that, this map shows vaccine apartheid took place. While African requests to manufacture their own vaccines were supported by some G20 countries like the US and India, it was blocked by others. In fact, richer countries stockpiled vaccines, while many African countries didn't even have enough supplies for their frontline doctors and nurses. Humanity faced a common enemy like never before with COVID-19, and our response was to leave lower income countries to fend for themselves. Where was the justice? And on the next slide, we can see about the IMF and special drawing rights that Samuel mentioned. Acting like a central bank for the world, in August 2001, the IMF created a major new issue of special drawing rights to ease the global liquidity crisis. The IMF said it was going to particularly help the most vulnerable countries who were struggling to cope. The historic $650 billion should have been much needed good news for children in Africa, denied COVID-19 funding and vaccines. However, the special drawing rights were allocated extremely unfairly, and the next graph shows how much funding governments in each region receive per child. You can see just a discriminatory $50 per African child. How did the UK and Belgium get more funds than all 48 countries in sub-Saharan Africa put together? Is it the population? Well, if we look at the next slide, no. They have a fraction of the population. It is because they have more votes, the UK and Belgium, than all 48 countries in sub-Saharan Africa combined, as they have done at the IMF since colonial times. When the most important financial organizations in the world are accountable to richer countries, and in fact have always been led by people from rich countries, is it any wonder that the global economic system is so unjust? The next slide and the report looks at climate as well, and we have a global climate crisis. But that name, global climate crisis, hides the fact that the world's climate was ruined by a particular set of countries. The repercussions are global, but it was caused by these very specific countries. The blue bars show the rate each country has contributed to the climate crisis per person. It's the amount of CO2 emissions in the last 100 years. It is a very unequal graph. Yet the orange bars, if we click, we'll see, show how vulnerable countries are to the climate crisis. So according to the Notre Dame Index, as you can see, the heaviest vulnerability is being paid by those countries with the least responsibility. And where are the sub-Saharan African countries? On the next click, they show in orange, with 95% of the world's rain-fed agriculture in Africa and high current temperatures and significant deserts in many countries. Africa is particularly vulnerable to the rich countries' inability to curb their emissions. It is climate injustice. And on the next slide, we look at debt. And whilst people and companies can declare bankruptcy, a recent US president, for example, ran 6 businesses that declared bankruptcy. The situation for countries is very different. If we go on to the next slide, please. For decades, debt was used by rich countries. Or if we skip to the next slide, please. For decades, debt was used by richer countries to force conditionalities on poor countries, including, tragically, with structural adjustment programs. And more recently, debt is also to a broader range of countries, including the government of China and to multinational private companies. If we could go to the next slide, please. Thank you. Even though the private lenders, the private companies such as Glencore and BlackRock, the largest known holder of external private debt in poorer countries, get really high rates of interest, When things go wrong, such as a crop failure or recession, those companies don't pay for any share of the risk. When African countries are bankrupt, they are forced, often, by the IMF to keep paying the debt back to private creditors based in rich countries, who seem to be the priority. We're in a new debt crisis now. In countries including Uganda, Angola, and Zambia, debt interest payments have far overtaken education budgets, and now even health budgets, and have got a lot higher since 2015. More and more countries have been trapped in unsustainable debt since the start of the SDGs, but there's been hardly any international interest in the crisis, and even less action. The much heralded G20 debt initiative has supported only one country in 2 years, and the rest of the countries have been left practically bankrupt, and their children are paying the price. And if we look at where these children live, if we use the IMF's own data of countries that have unsustainable debt, there are 55 million children affected. It's difficult to even see the share of that 55 million that live outside of Africa. 99.95% of African children. And you have to ask, is this why the world and the G20 is being so slow to act on the new debt crisis? Now, if we look at the next slide, the recently released report that you have, and the French version being released today, actually considers another 7 injustices to African children, including the broken promises on ODA and aid funding, and several caused by failures on corruption and conflict within and outside of African countries. I can't share them all in the time we have, but you can read the others in the report on the tables. But I will share this graph of all the overall impact. And you can see that 9 injustices were costed. These modern injustices, since 2015 alone, have cost over $4 trillion combined, we estimate, for Africa. Now, the international aspects, the international ones in red, account for about 95% of that $4 trillion cost. Now, all of these figures are approximate. There will be overlap, and we'd like to work with others to refine the analysis. But it's really clear that these modern injustices, underpinned by the inequality and representation of Africa in international fora outside of the UN, are worth several trillion in the first 6 years of the SDGs alone. And in fact, when you look at this graph, it's not so hard to see why child labor in Africa has been going up since 2015. But the heaviest cost is not measured in dollars, but in children's lives. And on this final graph, it shows the number of children under 5 who've died in the first 5 years of the SDGs. If we could go to the next slide, please. The difference between the regions is huge. In fact, the only other way to put it in context is to compare it with another number. More young African children have died in the first 5 years of the SDGs than all of the world's military victims during the 5 years of World War I. And the most upsetting thing about this is that we actually know how to end poverty and child labor. Country after country has achieved it. Given the chance, people will lift themselves and their families out of poverty if we end the injustices. To reverse the damage of the last decade, a swift instigation and financing of a global child benefit initiative is being called for by the Nobel laureates and by the youth activists from Africa. It would provide benefits to every child and new mother in low-income countries, and it could be funded with 1.4% of rich countries' social protection budgets. Expanded school feeding and education programs could be funded by a fair allocation of special drawing rights. No African country is a member of the G7. Only 1 African country out of 54 is in the G20. The OECD has 38 member countries, but not a single one is African. And the voting power at the World Bank and IMF is dominated by non-African countries. This systemic injustice needs to change. Now, the responsibility mainly lies with the richest countries, but as the G20 has taken on its important global governance, it needs to put its own house in order. International public opinion too often blames Africa and Africans for their own exploitation. But these are modern international injustices, and they're very important. World wealth has doubled in the last 20 years, yet child labor in the poorest countries is going up. How rich do we have to be before we will act? Let us support the demands from young campaigners in our countries, like Samuel, and like Amu. Let's not repress their protests, but instead let's take their protests to the UN and the international community. It is time, my friends, it is time. Justice for Africa's children. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Merci, Monsieur James. La parole est à Madame Mariam Baba Moussa. Merci.
Merci, Monsieur Honorable Président du Parlement de la CEDEAO.
Oui, un instant. Oui.
Honorable Speaker, yes, we want to raise our tag for intervention. Are we now for discussion, or we want? Is it time for discussion?
Vous allez intervenir à la fin des pénalistes. Inch'Allah, vous allez poser des questions et ils vont vous répondre. Tout est prévu. Merci.
Honorable Président, vice-président du Parlement de la CEDEAO, honorables députés ici présents, honorables invités et membres de ce panel, j'ai l'insigne honneur de vous faire connaître les bonnes pratiques au Bénin en matière de traite et de travail des enfants. Je ne pourrais pas aller directement vous présenter ces pratiques sans parler de l'état des lieux des instruments juridiques en matière de traite des personnes et de travail des enfants. Je fais allusion à tous les instruments juridiques internationaux, nationaux et régionaux. Et je ne saurais également occulter la mise en œuvre de ces instruments. Mais je suis heureuse d'avoir constaté que mes prédécesseurs, notamment M. Akiro et Mme Kolaole, ont parlé de long en large de tous ces instruments et de leur mise en œuvre, que ce soit au niveau de l'UIP, au niveau général, c'est-à-dire de la CEDEAO. Alors, ce que je voudrais faire, c'est de survoler, de surpasser rapidement ces aspects, mais je voudrais vous dire que de toutes les conventions que nous avons citées, il n'y a qu'une seule convention que j'ai constatée que le Bénin n'a pas ratifiée, mais c'est approfondi, c'est la 189 concernant le travail domestique. Et donc, je vais demander au présentateur de commencer par le slide qui est relatif à l'introduction. Et puis, je vais faire l'introduction et on va survoler les deux rubriques dont j'ai parlé pour que j'aille directement sur les bonnes pratiques au Bénin. En termes d'introduction, je dirais que le travail, c'est-à-dire travail et la traite des enfants, constituent de graves formes de violation des droits humains en général et des droits des enfants en particulier, au regard des statistiques mondiales qui font état de ce que 160 millions d'enfants seraient concernés par ce phénomène, dont 80 millions environ pour la seule région subsaharienne. Au niveau du continent africain, un rapport publié en 2019 par l'Union africaine révèle que 72 millions d'enfants sont en situation de travail, soit un enfant sur 5, et 41% de ce chiffre se constitue, c'est-à-dire c'est les enfants âgés de 5 à 11 ans. Ces statistiques sur le travail des enfants en Afrique sont alarmantes et comparées à ce qui se passe aux statistiques des régions dans les autres, c'est-à-dire dans les autres continents. Au Bénin, le phénomène s'est aggravé bien que le pays soit parti à plusieurs instruments internationaux régionaux, et en dépit des efforts consentis par le gouvernement béninois avec le soutien bien sûr des parlementaires. En effet, les études statistiques en 2020 ont montré que plus d'un enfant sur 2 était impliqué dans le travail des enfants et près de 4 enfants sur 10 travaillent dans des conditions dangereuses avec des taux de prévalence dans les départements de Koufo, c'est le sud-est, 82%, le plateau, c'est le sud. Non, le Koufo sud-ouest, le plateau sud-est, 68%. Aliboris, c'est le nord-est, 62%. Et le Borgou, toujours dans le nord-est, 60%. En effet, des études réalisées en 2020 ont montré que plus d'un enfant sur 2 était impliqué dans le travail des enfants et près de 4 enfants sur 10 travaillent dans des conditions dangereuses avec des taux de prévalence dans les départements de Koufo élevés, 82%, le plateau 68% et la Liborie et le Borgou également 60%. Dans ces régions, la traite des enfants a plusieurs facettes et partant de l'esclavage domestique aux travaux forcés. Pour venir à bout de ce fléau, il est nécessaire d'impliquer tous les acteurs de la société, notamment les organisations de la société civile nationale et internationale, les partenaires techniques et financiers et les parlementaires. J'en ai parlé tout à l'heure, c'est dans ce sens que l'Union interparlementaire a fait de la lutte contre la traite et le travail des enfants son cheval de bataille. Je ne vais pas revenir sur ce point qui nous a été fait. Je disais tantôt que j'allais survoler les instruments juridiques et la mise en œuvre et je prie les slides peuvent passer rapidement et ces slides, vous verrez que le Bénin est bien riche dans ces instruments-là juridiques et vous constaterez également qu'en matière de mise en œuvre, plusieurs ministères et plusieurs associations internationales interviennent. Ce qui m'importe ici, c'est d'aller vous présenter l'expérience du Bénin. Donc, vous avez sur la présentation tous les aspects qui concernent vraiment la traite, les statistiques sur la traite et le travail des enfants. Ceci étant, nous allons directement sur les bonnes pratiques en matière de lutte contre la traite et le travail des enfants au Bénin. Et il faut reconnaître qu'au Bénin, malgré les nombreux efforts consentis par le gouvernement et les organisations nationales et internationales de lutte contre la traite et le travail des enfants, le phénomène persiste et face à cette situation, la stratégie adoptée par le Bénin a consisté à la mutualisation des efforts, le travail en synergie de toutes les structures gouvernementales, non gouvernementales et institutions internationales impliquées dans la lutte contre la traite et le travail des enfants. En outre, la mise en œuvre des différents projets inscrits au programme d'action du gouvernement et les projets financés par les partenaires techniques et financiers qui concourent à la réduction de la pauvreté sont exécutés dans l'approche holistique et globalisante. Et qu'est-ce que j'appelle approche holistique et globalisante, c'est-à-dire l'enfant, il faut le prendre dans son milieu, où il est avec ses parents, les leaders religieux, les rois, les leaders d'opinion et tous ceux qui l'entourent. Et maintenant, on aide les parents de l'enfant pour les sortir de la pauvreté. On amène des projets pour le soutenir, pour soutenir ces enfants, et on amène l'eau et l'électricité. On fait des infrastructures pour que le paysan qui revient des travaux champêtres ne soit pas ennuyé. Excusez-moi le terme, je ne vais pas dire pour bondir sur son épouse, mais je dirais qu'il n'a d'autres distractions que ça. Donc, lorsque nous sommes dans l'approche holistique et globalisante, eh bien, l'impact est réel. Et les exemples, je m'en vais vous donner le cas d'un exemple que je peux dire qui concerne la consolidation de la collaboration institutionnelle, les synergies d'action, l'inclusivité et l'harmonisation des mécanismes. Et en 2017, mon pays, le Bénin, a été incriminé dans un rapport du département d'État des États-Unis d'Amérique. Et ce rapport incriminait le Bénin, qui a été déclassé une deuxième fois, et il s'avère très urgent d'éviter la troisième fois parce que ça pourrait occulter la coopération entre le Bénin et les États-Unis. Alors, averti par le ministre des Affaires étrangères d'alors et l'ambassadrice des États-Unis d'Amérique près le Bénin, le ministre d'État chargé du plan et du développement a pris le lead de cette action. Et comment ça s'est passé? Tout de suite, il a installé une task force, et cette task force devait avoir comme tâche de faire une revue de documentaire et de rechercher des informations et de proposer un chronogramme, ce qui a été fait. Dans un deuxième temps, le travail a été élargi et tous les ministres, ce n'était pas de l'amusement parce que c'était sérieux, tous les ministres, contrairement à ce qui se passait, c'est que les projets sont exécutés de façon éparse. Les ONG et institutions travaillent chacun de son côté, les statistiques, on ne peut pas les regrouper. Alors ce travail a été fait au sein du ministère d'État, sous la supervision du ministre d'État chargé du plan et du développement. Et un mini-colloque a permis de regrouper les directeurs de cabinet de tous les ministères concernés, les 3 ministères de l'ordre d'enseignement, le ministère de la fonction publique, le ministère de l'Intérieur, de la sécurité publique, le ministère des Affaires étrangères, tous ces ministères, les institutions, les organisations de la société civile, il y a eu leurs premiers responsables qui ont eu à faire ce colloque, ce mini-colloque, et il a été mis en place 5 commissions, et qui, l'une se charge de la protection, et qui prend en charge l'aspect répression et le nettoyage des textes, et il y a une commission qui s'est occupée vraiment de tout ce qui est moyen à déployer pour que le travail soit fait. Alors, ça aboutit à l'organisation de la réflexion nationale sur la traite des personnes, et il y a eu des résultats concrets, probants. Et entre autres, je peux dire qu'il y a eu comme résultat probant un rapport, le rapport qui a été fait a permis d'introduire un dossier en Conseil des ministres, et la conséquence, c'est que les organisations de formation à l'intention, excusez-moi, des acteurs concernés par la traite des enfants, l'OCPM, Office central de la protection des mineurs, la police républicaine, les organisations de la société civile, les CPS et les centres de protection sociale, tout ce monde, on a renforcé leur formation, l'adoption du code pénal, il y a le code de procédure pénale également, qui a été introduit et nettoyé, les budgets qui ont été renforcés, et je puis vous dire que c'est la structure mise en place pour rassembler tout ce monde qui devait travailler périodiquement depuis 2017 jusqu'à présent. Cette structure existe et est fonctionnelle. Alors, d'autres bonnes pratiques, c'est encourager la scolarisation et le maintien des enfants à l'école. C'est revenu, tout le monde en a parlé. Et je peux dire au Bénin que malgré les efforts du gouvernement et de ses partenaires, le système éducatif est resté peu performant et la mise en place des cantines scolaires est l'une des pistes suivies par le gouvernement pour y remédier. En 2015 déjà, le taux d'achèvement du cycle primaire était de 60% en moyenne, avec un taux faible dans le département de la Liborie, 28%, c'est le nord-est du Bénin. Et l'installation des cantines scolaires a eu un effet, c'est que l'une des causes de la traite des enfants, c'est parce que les parents n'ont pas de moyens. Et figurez-vous que quand les parents doivent choisir entre la fille et un enfant qui doit aller à l'école, c'est tout de suite le garçon qui est indexé parce que la fille doit aller puiser de l'eau à 15 km, le temps de revenir, tout le monde est allé à l'école. Donc en 2017, le gouvernement a initié le programme des cantines scolaires et les résultats sont éloquents. Et la rentrée 2022-2023, déjà, il y a environ 1 080 000 écoliers qui bénéficieront du programme des cantines scolaires. Et d'ici à 2026, chaque enfant des établissements primaires aurait un repas chaud. Alors, ce qui est intéressant dans le principe des cantines scolaires, c'est que ces cantines sont approvisionnées par les produits locaux et du coup, les communautés sont impliquées et à travers les coopératives locales, agricoles, on arrive vraiment à avoir le ravitaillement. Ça veut dire quoi? Les parents ont des revenus pour vivre quand même décemment. De plus, les filles sont dispensées du paiement de la scolarité, les soutiens de fournitures sont distribués chaque année et puis on peut également citer des formations. Donc l'enfant est maintenu à l'école et mange et est formé. Par exemple, l'informatique, ils en bénéficient et c'est vraiment intéressant. Et l'expérience des cantines a permis d'augmenter le taux de scolarisation et améliorer les résultats aussi au niveau des examens au primaire et le taux d'achèvement du primaire qui était